Hi, my name is Lloyd Wright, and I'd like to welcome you to the Stellar Physical Medicine Educational Series. In this series, we're going to be discussing the Chinese principles of food as medicine. Now, in order to understand how to apply that and make it available and accessible to your life so that you can use this and begin to be healthier in your own way, we're going to cover some basic principles of food concepts. First, we're going to talk about yin and yang, what those principles actually mean, how those break out into food. Next, we're going to discuss external environment, and then internal environment, and then the nature of foods. When we get through with nature of food, then we'll talk a little bit about an ideal diet, and that'll be the end of this series. Our second series, we'll dive a little deeper into the flavors and combinations and recipes. And on our third series, we'll get to the fun part. We'll actually cook some food for you, show you how to make up some wonderful dishes, and how simple it can be to actually eat healthy. So, on that note, let us begin with discussion of the concepts of yin and yang. Now, almost everybody in the United States have heard of the concepts of yin and yang. Everywhere I've traveled, if I say yin and yang, people go, oh yes, of course we know what you mean. And more or less that's true. But the real details of it, what do yin and yang actually mean? It is a philosophical concept handed down from ancient China, in which there's an understanding that virtually everything in the universe is the result of what we think of as complementary opposites. So yin and yang basically means that for any item there is a conceptual opposite item for that. Now, the obvious ones are heat and cold, light and dark, male and female. These are all concepts of darkness. Now, you'll notice that also, for the most part, there's varying degrees on it. We would all agree that steam is definitely different than ice, but it's a gradient because water is definitely different than ice, and yet it is different than steam. Yet they're all the same element. So in principle, the yang elements are the energetic, the expanding, the moving, the more heat elements. So steam would be yang compared to water. Yet water would be yang compared to ice. Why? Because the opposite end, the yin component, would be cold, moist, more stillness, less energy. More of a containing function. To a large degree, you have yin that actually contains and directs the yang. And it has been said, first thing I learned in traditional Chinese medicine school, traditional Chinese medical theory 101, yin without yang settles. Yang without yin flees and scatters. So they really need to work together. And if you look at the universe, that is actually the way it is. In fact, an interesting note I observed, if we think about the concept of computers, for instance, probably you're watching this on a computer type device right now, but fundamentally everything that you're seeing on screen is the construct of a computer code constructed of two things, on or off. Very interesting. And so the ancient Chinese believed the entire universe was constructed similarly. Everything is constructed out of basically yin and yang. And out of the yin and yang, it is said they arose the 5 elements, which we discussed in our last video, and out of the 5 elements, the 10,000 things. In other words, all of the manifestation of reality. So fundamentally, everything we see around us is, to one degree or another, a play on yin and yang, an infinite play. So that's the philosophical part of the whole equation. Let's go ahead and break this down into what does this mean for physical body, what does this mean for your health? Because that's where the rubber meets the road. It's how good are you feeling today, and how can we help you to feel a little bit better? So let's start with talking about the environment. So we are going to apply these principles of yin and yang to each one of these concepts as we go through. So when we look at the environment, the question I'm going to ask is, for you, what sort of environment do you live in? Do you live in a climate that's cold and dry, or do you live in a climate that's hot and damp? Cold and dry, I could think of Canada or Calgary or perhaps Montana, and damp and warm could be like Louisiana, or if you go to the Amazon jungle, there's a lot of heat and a lot of dampness involved in those climates. Here in Arizona, where I'm located, oftentimes it's very hot, but it's a bit more on the dry side. But I want you to think about that because you've got to take your own environment into consideration before you construct a diet for yourself. If you don't do this, you could very easily go amiss. Now, also keep in mind your climate changes. Most climates have 4 seasons. Some, like Arizona, seem to have 2 seasons. But whatever the case is, you need to pay attention to it. If you have a storm front coming through, you're going to have more dampness in your climate. Even if you live in the desert, that dampness will be there at least for a short while. So you have to think about that. And how are you going to construct your diet to consider the environment that you're in? Now, the next environment that's important to consider, and perhaps even more important, is your own internal environment. For this, you need to really do an objective check-in for yourself. The fact is, we're all a little bit different, and the human body runs the gamut of too hot to too cold to everything in between. Now, I'm sure most of us know somebody who in the middle of summer is still wearing a sweater. There are some people in the middle of winter that feel hot all the time. So we simply understand that some people tend to run more hot, some run more cold. For the most part, most of us run in between. And so we'll kind of respond to the climate that we're in and how we change our interior climate. So the interior climate is changed. We're going to talk about that more in terms of diet than anything else. But the exterior climate, again, you'll look at what is your climate that you're in and how does that affect you. So ask yourself the question, do you tend to run cold all the time? If you do, you're more of a yin body type and you have more coldness. You're going to want to address that by warming that body up. Those of you who have more heat in the body and tend to feel hot all the time, you're going to need to cool things down. And you can actually do this by adjusting the diet. So we're going to jump in and discuss the dietary principles on that in a couple of minutes. Next point we're going to talk about is the concept of dampness and also phlegm. There's a third factor that goes beyond cold or hot, and that would be dampness or dryness. So people who tend to run cold are going to tend to run more damp. Sometimes people who run hot will run damp, but more typically they'll be more on the dry side. You'll know if you're damp or you're dry by the amount of fluids or excess fluids in your system. People who tend to be too dry will tend to run warm. They'll tend to have dryness in their sinuses, dryness in their mouth. They may have a lack of saliva. They may have a lack of good digestive fluids. There's an array of things that you can look at. People who are too dry will tend to be drinking more water. People who are too damp will tend to have a lot more phlegm conditions, postnasal drip. Accompanying the damp condition will be oftentimes a sense of sluggishness, heaviness in the limbs, almost a sense of feeling a little bit waterlogged. So if you're sensing any of that, a little sluggish or waterlogged, odds are that you're experiencing a little too much damp or phlegm in the body. You can also take a quick look at the tongue picture. If your tongue is showing scallops or bumps along the edges, that's a sure sign that you're retaining fluids. People who tend to run dry will tend to run a little bit more restless, as opposed to sluggish. So those are a couple of concepts. It's very important to realize that. If there's a lot of phlegm in the system, you definitely are going to want to curb your diet. So let's talk about food nature now. So the nature of food can equally be anything from hot to cold and from dry to moist. Now those concepts tend to align, but it is true there are some things that are moist and warm, and there are some things that are cool and dry. But as a general rule, you'll see how that works out. And we'll show you a food chart in a couple of minutes here to give you some general examples of food and how that sort of works. But what we're talking about here is the actual effect of the food on your body. So there are foods that will tend to warm you up or cool you off. Foods that will tend to generate more dampness and phlegm. and foods that will tend to be more drying and eliminate dampness and phlegm.